I have long used the image of paddling down rapids as the way you navigate through life. For me, the current's bringing you one direction. You can sometimes eddy out and pause a little bit and catch your breath. You don't decide where the rocks are, you just decide how to make it around them, and you have to respond to what life throws at you as you keep paddling down the river.
That familiar voice is Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, Honorary Fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and for our purposes today, avid lover of paddling and all things canoe. He's our guest on our second annual Summer Canoe series here on the Canadian Geographic Explore podcast. Welcome to all you explorers out there, armchair and in motion. Before we get to our guest, a reminder that if you want more amazing storytelling about this incredible country of ours, it can be yours with a subscription to Canadian Geographic magazine. For over 90 years, this award-winning magazine has been bringing unique, thoughtful, awe-inspiring stories and photography about this great land of ours. An annual subscription is just $28.50. Such a bargain. To sign up, go to canadiangeographic.ca/subscribe. You'll be happy that you did. So it's a great thrill to have Prime Minister Trudeau join us for our second annual Summer Canoe series. We recorded it on the top floor of the RCGS headquarters with stunning views overlooking the mighty Ottawa River, one of the world's great canoeing and exploration routes. As you'll hear, Prime Minister Trudeau is absolutely passionate about canoeing. So not surprisingly, our conversation is a fun ride. It takes us through the rapids of the Nahanni to lakes and rivers of the boreal forest and frothing waters of the Rouge, the Tatshenshini-Alsek, the Dumoine. We're joined on this journey by his father, another canoe-loving Prime Minister, and canoe legends like Bill Mason and Chuck Commanda. I don't think he needs any more introduction, so let's get right to my talk with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
I'll just kick it off and say, Prime Minister Trudeau, thank you so much for coming on the Canadian Geographic Explore podcast.
No, what a pleasure to be here. Any chance I get to talk about canoeing, I'm all in.
Well, if we are thinking of prime ministers who are canoers, probably the only other one that comes up like you would be your father. So there's a real...
Well, I'm only that way because that's how he raised me. So I don't know if that counts as two or just one continuity.
Yeah, I want to talk about the canoe behind us first, because that we think is a Chuck Commanda birch bark canoe. So from
Could
this
be.
area.
I look at that and I am reminded of summer days up at Harrington Lake where my father had the birch bark canoe out. I think it's the one that's now in the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough. But he'd stir up this horrible smelling mixture of pitch and bear grease and sort of paint it on the seams of the birch bark canoe to keep it intact. And I'm like, Dad, where'd you get bear grease from? He's like, oh, Elder Commanda got it for me or something. It was like, but I remember he wasn't necessarily he wasn't a man with a lot of hobbies. Mm-hmm. So seeing him do that was like amazing. And,
that was his release, I guess.
Yeah,
right?
It really was.
Which is incredible. So I want to go on, starting a bit of a tangent. When I was graduating high school, you'll get the end of the year, everyone's signing each other's yearbooks. And we had this amazing English teacher, a guy named Larry Peters, who had also led us all on a canoe trip down the Dumoine River, just up here. Amazing whitewater river.
I did the Dumoine a few years ago with my kids, actually.
Oh, wow. It's lovely.
It's a beautiful river.
Yeah, so we'd done that with him. He'd been my English teacher. He signs my yearbook, and in it he writes, "I like you better with a paddle in your hand." And so I
think that's a very Canadian thing. You wouldn't want to be friends with anyone who you didn't like more when they had a paddle in their hand.
Well, so I have to say it was put out at first, right? A little like, but then exactly, this is where I landed. I like me better with a paddle in my hand. And I know you've been canoeing, as you said, since you were a kid with your dad and with some amazing people through that. And it's still something you get back to, even with the challenges of your job and the time.
Oh, at any given day you can ask me when was the last time in a canoe, and I can tell you exactly. Last time I was in a canoe was earlier this summer when we went to Halifax for the North American Indigenous Games, and I had Hadrian, my youngest, beside me, and we were in a big war canoe with a bunch of Mi'kmaq leaders crossing the lake. So, for me, any chance I can get with a paddle in my hand is a good day.
But why canoeing? What is the feeling it brings you?
I think there's two things that make paddling so important. One is, to be a good paddler, you've got to be in balance. And not just literally, but I mean, yes, you have to be attuned to how you're sitting, where you physically are in the canoe, how you're leaning and all that. But you got to be attuned to what the waves and the winds are doing, what the rapids are doing. If you want to stay up and if you want to stay dry-ish, you've got to have a really strong sense, not just of self, but how self fits into the world around you. So that sense of balance, of awareness, of what people call mindfulness these days, that's a word I don't use a lot, but I recognize it when yogis talk to me about that. For me, it's in a canoe. But the other thing that matters so much about a canoe is it's never about the destination. It's about the journey. Mm-hmm. It's about you're traveling somewhere. You're with someone, or you're very much with yourself when you're soloing on a trip. But there's something connected, and there's a process, and you cannot ignore the scenery when you're canoeing. You cannot not be part of the landscape you're in when you're canoeing. So in terms of grounding who you are, where you are, what you are, as you paddle down rivers that you know were having this done for centuries, for millennia before any of us were around, there's something so... Grounding is probably the wrong word because you're in a canoe on water, but it's centering you in what you are and who you are.
Yeah. Roy McGregor said, no canoe, no Canada.
I couldn't imagine the person I am without being a canoeist, without being a paddler. I mean, Roy actually, I remember a conversation with him about my first canoeing experience on camera, which was a picture my mom took of me in the bow of an old Grumman that my dad had going down the little outflow rapids up at Harrington Lake, and that's a photo I have on the wall of my office. Actually, it's a triptych where there's that picture of me and my dad when I was probably about 5 years old maybe, and then the next picture is me with my dad in an inflatable canoe or an inflatable sport yak going down the Rouge, and my father's in the front and I'm in the back, and it was one from my river guiding days going down the Sister Elizabeth Sill. And then the third picture is a picture of me and my two kids, and Sophie was pregnant with the third, and Sophie up on the Yukon River in Whitehorse from many years ago. So just that idea of the canoe as being something that runs through my entire life is hugely who I am.
Yeah. I haven't heard people doing whitewater in the Gatineau Hills, so that's amazing. I want to take you from the rushing waters of Harrington Lake to the Nahanni. And when we lined this interview up with you, we had some friends at CPAWS, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, who said, "Oh, well, you did a trip with them in 2003 on the Nahanni."
In the summer of 2003, I was approached by CPAWS, and I was very much a civilian then. I think I was back studying engineering in Montreal at that point, and they asked me if I wanted to go up and do this thing for the Nahanni, and it was part of the Boreal initiative and expanding Nahanni National Park. And I leapt on it, and it was just an absolutely incredible trip. And it did lead to working with, one of the good things the Harper government did was under Jim Prentice as Environment Minister, expanding the Nahanni National Park Reserve a few years later. So I was glad to have contributed to that in what was an amazing paddling trip.
It's a beautiful spot. So it's that mountain range, and those western rivers too. They're so different than here.
And it was one of my dad's favorite rivers, and he'd done it a couple of times. And I can't look at Virginia Falls without knowing that center rock is called Mason Rock, at least in the mind of everyone around after Bill. And for me, like I paddled the Kootenay with my father when we were younger as well. So at the time I spent, and I did a rafting trip with him years later on the Tatshenshini-Alsek. So I mean, being those western and northern rivers is a huge delight.
Yeah, no, they're amazing. So I want to say we've got, CPAWS you did a journal for them. So
I remember having done a journal for the first few days, and then it slacked off.
Well, I have to say, as someone who only does usually first 4 days of any journal, I completely sympathize and understand. But what you wrote was great, and I'm wondering if you can read just an excerpt from us here. And it's you and Jerry Butts were in a canoe together, so you're a long time.
There we go. Second day on the river. Jerry and I studied river maps and diagrams, talked to the guides, hiked ahead around the eddy and up the cliff to study the rapids, and finally decided on the perfect line to take. We had it theorized down to the millimeter. Of course, what ended up getting us through was only sheer dumb luck and frantic paddling, but isn't that always the way? And there's a little drawing of the figure-8 rapids.
And it's such a metaphor for maybe politics, maybe life generally too. I mean, it's...
I have long used the image of paddling down rapids as the way you navigate through life. For me, like the current's bringing you one direction, and you can sometimes eddy out and pause a little bit and catch your breath. You don't decide where the rocks are, you just decide how to make it around them, and you have to respond to what life throws at you as you keep paddling down the river. And for me, that's
sometimes just paddle hard.
Just paddle hard. Well, what happens if the wind comes up on the river? Well, paddle harder and sing louder.
So, I mean, you mentioned Bill Mason, who I think kind of taught you to paddle.
He did. I remember some of my first canoe trips with him on the Pickenock up here in north of in the Outaouais. We did La Petite Nation with him years later. It was he was the one who really, well, my dad sort of roped him in to help teach us how to.
They were good friends, I think. They
were great friends.
I mean, for people who don't know him, he was kind of the Yoda of canoeing, kind of is, I mean, a glib way to put it, but he was really made all these incredible books and movies.
He was the person that, you know, God put on earth to teach us all how to paddle. Yeah.
And what was he, I mean, what was that like being in a canoe with the master, basically?
I didn't know he was a master. My dad was he was just a friend of my dad's, and I knew he was, you know, great at it, but he was always, you know, thoughtful and warm and generous, and I didn't feel like, you know, as he was correcting my J-stroke and pushing me towards using more of a Canadian or whatever, I didn't have a proper appreciation. He was just that, you know, great friend of my dad's who had a place with wolves on Meech Lake and would come and paddle with us in these, you know, great outings. Where, to be honest, given the childhood I had, given the amount of time my dad was away working, for me, those precious moments on the river, regardless of Bill Mason being with us, was much more about me focusing on being with my dad.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And you do that with your children now. This spring, I took Zav down the Rivière à Simon near Morin Heights with actually my brother and his son. So it was actually it was a group of, when I said, okay, Sash, yeah, let's go, we'll do it this weekend, he called a few of his friends, and it was like 6 dads and their sons in canoes going down this, you know, really, really fun little river. And then we all sort of looked at each other and goes, oh yeah, today's Mother's Day. This is not maybe the day where all the dads should go off and have a great time. But it was one of those things. But Zav actually skipped a basketball tournament, and he's a huge basketball player. It's something that he loves and everything, but I'm a terrible basketball player, and so I can barely even sort of, you know, goof around with him outside the house in the driveway. So for him to have taken time away from what was an important tournament to come paddling with me for the day meant the world to me, but also I know meant the world to him. And it's those moments of bonding when you're, you know, doing something like paddling down a whitewater river that are the things that will stay with him for the rest of his life, the way moments like that with my dad stay with me. Yeah, and there's something about focusing it all down too. You're in that canoe together. Of course. The rest of the world just sort of drifts. And of all the canoes, everybody swam except us, and he was very pleased with that. Well done. Yeah, no, that is worth bragging about. Yeah, I know. And I'm sure there was some bragging too. Just a little, you know. You have to. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Your dad, obviously, I've mentioned, was a big canoeer, and he did this epic trip from Montreal to James Bay, right? In his 20s, I think. Yeah, there's a lot of. He used to tell us stories about that, and we just. I mean, that's before sat phones. That's
Oh yeah, no, I was not particularly envious of him on that trip, but I've always been envious of the stories you told me of paddling the copper mine, which is one of my goals.
He did a lot of the Arctic rivers.
Oh yeah, he just loved it.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, even in an era of sat phones, when you get up there, you are properly out there.
Yeah, no, I did the Wind River a few years ago, and that was, yeah, no, absolutely lovely. And again, yeah, didn't see another person for 2 weeks. Yeah, it's like lovely. I want to quote him because there's quite a famous quote that he has. What sets a canoeing expedition apart is that it purifies you more rapidly and inescapably than any other. Travel 1,000 miles by train and you're a brute. Paddle 500 on a bicycle and you remain basically a bourgeois. Paddle 100 in a canoe and you're already a child of nature. Now, your dad wrote that about 80 years ago, I think. Yeah. Does that still stand up today?
Oh yeah, it's from his essay, Aesthetic in a Canoe. I was amused by the quote because it's a concretization of just the way he was and the way he raised us. And for me, making sure I raise my kids so they are comfortable in a canoe, so they know what they're doing, is foundational. It's part of the job of a parent in Canada for me anyway, is making sure my kids can paddle. And I know that's not something that's available to a whole bunch of people, but it was the way I was raised. And you know, in this era of social media and everything, digital tech or anything, getting all the more important, getting out there into something that requires your presence and your peacefulness at the same time, even as there's moments of adrenaline. There's a concreteness about it and a spirituality about it that I think is just foundational for the soul.
And so we've been through a summer now where obviously forest fires have been a big part of what the conversation has been about, and it's the boreal forest, which is, you know, a big chunk of what this country is, and a big chunk of what we paddle through. You know, as someone who has paddled those areas, I mean, what's it like watching this happen, and what more needs to be done to stop that?
Well, I think obviously the fight against climate change is unbelievably important, and I know there's lots of reflections on you know, the contribution of climate change to any one event, but the increase in extreme weather events, whether it's floods and atmospheric rivers or forest fires or even more intense hurricanes like we saw with Fiona last year, these are things that we have to be conscious of and do everything we can to prevent or at least minimize. But fires have always been a part of you know, forests, and it's that interface with communities as they spread, as we you know, prevent more fires and therefore the accumulation of brush. I mean, there's all these theories on it, and I think we need to be really mindful about our responsibility to protect nature. Not just as we fight climate change, but also, you know, step up. When you know, I got the first taste of politics when Harper's government made changes to the Navigable Waters Act, which got all canoeists sort of up in arms about that. And I remember being asked about that early on when I just got elected in 2015, and I just laughed and said, Canada just elected a canoeist as Prime Minister. You're not going to have to worry about navigable waters. But then, you know, when we hosted COP15 just last year, we set those global targets of 30% of land and 30% of sea protected by 2030. We just brought forward a budget that has investments in freshwater strategy that is about $650 million over the next 10 years to protect, whether it's the Great Lakes or the Mackenzie or, you know, anywhere in between. These are serious things. The way we're working with indigenous groups to create, you know, massive indigenous-led conservation areas.
The Guardians program.
Yeah, these are things that matter on every level. Yes, we need to protect biodiversity and nature. We also need to protect, you know, the opportunity of Canadians in future generations to have these experiences that have shaped this country and continue to shape so many of us.
You touched on a little earlier just the accessibility of canoeing for a lot of people, and it is still, I mean, if you get on the rivers, it's a very white sport still, you know, or it's a pastime, and it's, personally, I think it's really important that we can get, especially new Canadians, people who have less resources out there, and because it connects people with our vast wilderness in a way that's important to keeping it that way, right? And how do we make that more accessible?
Well, I think people understand. The more I get out to national parks, the more you see a greater diversity of Canadians going out and literally only dipping their toe in at first, but you see more and more families doing that because there is an understanding that what so many of us take for granted in this country is not the reality elsewhere around the world. And we put forward programs when we were when we celebrated Canada 150. We made national parks accessible to all Canadians for free. And that was huge, and we translated that, hugely responded, including by a whole bunch of people who'd never been out to our national parks before, and we followed up with saying, well, when you get your Canadian citizenship, you get a free pass to the national parks for the next year, or whatever. It was something that we really did on that. And then I remember we actually ran in a piece of our platform, which perhaps was something I put in to make sure that I'd have at least one day in a canoe during an election campaign, was the Learn to Camp program that National Parks put forward, which was all about taking new Canadians and giving them the opportunity to learn how to camp, to get in a canoe, to do all those sorts of things. So I think it's just something we need to continue to be deliberate about encouraging people to do, because the barrier is not that people won't like it, or it's just so many times people don't know how, if you weren't put in a canoe when you were 2 years old like I was, then well, how do you even start? That's what we need to keep shifting and opening up, and the more we can talk about it, celebrate it, and create accessibility for it, the better off we'll be.
Favorite canoe?
Probably a Prospector, in a ode to Bill.
So cedar canvas or
cedar canvas. I like a canoe with a little more heft, although if I'm on a lot of portages, I'll pick a Kevy every time. Actually, one of my favorite canoes probably was that old 17-foot Grumman we had that was indestructible, that we used to wrap around rocks, that we used to sink, we used to for me, actually when my son was starting at a new school, it was late August, and he was like, well, they're taking us out on a orientation day, or we're going to go up and goof around in canoes. And I'm like, okay, well, you got to learn how to do a canoe over canoe. He's like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, okay. And it was a cold day in late August, but we went out in 2 canoes, and I had him swamping it and showed him how to flip the canoe, turn it over, put it back in. And he was like, oh God, I made him do it twice in freezing cold and everything. It was fine. And then 3 days later, he goes out, and they all go out on canoes on Lac Philippe, and sure enough, someone swamps right away. And even before the teachers and instructors sort of came over, he and his buddy were paddling over. They did a full canoe over canoe, got them back in, was a total hero. And he's like, that was his introduction to his new school. And he was like, that was pretty good, Dad.
That's a successful canoe dad.
Exactly. I was incredibly proud. He just wants me to stop telling the story. So I think this might be the last time.
This might be the last, Ellie. That's fantastic. Those Grummans were indestructible.
Oh, I know.
That Dumoine trip, we wrapped one.
Yeah.
And I remember we hammered it back into shape and duct tape, I think, in a few places.
And
finished the trip.
Duct tape is like the Force. It has a dark side and a light side, and it binds the universe together.
It does absolutely do that. We ask everyone who comes on this podcast about a favorite place in Canada, which I know is difficult for you as a Prime Minister, but I'm going to actually ask you to narrow it down.
My favorite place in Canada is in the stern of any canoe I happen to be in, anywhere.
I want a stretch of water.
Yeah. I think I know what it is, but I'm not sure, because there's so many more lakes and rivers that I'm going to be paddling over the rest of my life.
Yeah. It's
the next one will be my favorite, I think. Yeah.
So, but you don't even have to just tell us what it is, just describe it for me. Describe what you're seeing as you go down that stretch of water.
Not full-on rapids, it's ripples.
Nice.
There's rapids around the bend, but they're not quite there yet. I don't see any signs of habitation. I've got packs in front of me in my canoe, and someone I love, maybe my daughter, in the bow in front of me. and we're excited about what's around the bend, and looking forward to whatever it is we're going to mess up on the campsite for dinner that night.
That sounds lovely. And what's a favorite memory with your dad and the canoe?
There's too many, and not enough.
Yeah. Did you do northern rivers with him? Like, did you?
Not really. I didn't. Canoeing was often something he went off to do with his grown-up friends. Yeah. So when I was with him on the Tatshenshini-Alsek in a rafting trip, that was one of the first times that we got to really bond. I was on the river like that. I was sort of 19, and it was our first sort of grown-up trip together. But he was already sort of getting older, and we weren't able to do as much as I would have liked on that. But I got to see him out there, and he actually got to see me interacting with people. He actually came back and told my mom afterwards, you know, Justin's actually very good with people. Okay, so he was with a group of strangers on this trip that we all ended up fast friends at the end of it, like one does on a canoe.
You're going to be okay.
Yeah, the kid's going to be okay. I don't know that he'll be Prime Minister one day, but he's going to be okay. Is sort of the attitude on that. Yeah.
He kept paddling. I mean, he did the trip down the Petawawa when he was 77.
Oh yeah, no. He kept paddling a lot, but I didn't do enough with him. But one of the things I did, I remember when I decided after that trip that I wanted to get, I'd done sort of canoeing guide and camp counselor in Algonquin Park and up in the Temagami. I decided I wanted a little more intensity than we were allowed with camp counseling, which is you don't do the rapids with the kids. So I went and got a summer job on the Rouge as a whitewater river guide, and I'll remember, 6 days in on the river, you're supposed to have like a dozen days as a rookie or 20 days as a rookie before they'll actually let you guide their boat. And I was 6 days in, and they handed me my paddle, and they said, okay, it's a busy Saturday, we got no one to do it, you're on. And I'm like, I'm only 6 days in. And I'm like, yep, nope, but you're doing it. And it was that sense of, wow, well, I actually know water, I know what I'm doing. I never thought of myself as being a good rafter because, well, rafting is just easy canoeing.
Right.
And you just point at the big waves and go at it.
Go right over them.
Exactly, go through them and try. But then when I went back to canoeing on the Nahanni a few years later, after having been a whitewater guide for a few years, I hadn't been in a canoe for a while. I learned that I developed habits around anticipating and pre-positioning that made me a significantly better canoeer, or at least minimal, because it was just, you learn how to read the water and position things so you're nice and perpendicular, and you can, but it also taught me the bad habit. I never looked for the sneak lines. I always looked for the biggest waves to go through in the middle, and of course would be bailing after every rapids, but you gotta love it.
Amazing. What advice would you have for people who are thinking about canoeing, just starting out? Like, what's the best way to wet your feet?
Just to not wet your feet.
No, or not wet your feet.
Pick a nice day. Make sure you're going out with someone who knows what they're doing enough to teach you the J stroke, so you're not doing the goon stroke, and be open to it. Be patient with yourself, and understand the silence and the bliss that comes with it. But as for anything, don't overthink it. Just look for an occasion to do it.
Yeah, lovely. Well, I think that's a good note to leave it on.
Well, what a pleasure. We can chat about canoeing for hours, as most paddlers can.
Yeah, no, and thank you very much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure to meet you, and hopefully we'll cross paths on a river someday.
I'd like that very much.
Great. Well, thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for listening. Up next in our canoe series is RCGS Explorer-in-Residence Adam Schultz, talking about his epic paddling journey from Lake Erie to the Arctic Ocean. And we also have a ton of great canoeing conversations in our past episodes, including paddling legends James Raffin, Wally Shaber, Adam Schultz, also Canada's canoeing poet laureate, the great Roy McGregor. And if you like this podcast, please do us a big favor. Give us a rating and review wherever you listen. It helps more people find these conversations. And be sure to subscribe. That way, you won't miss any future episodes. So, until next time, when we'll explore again. I'm David McGuffin.
I think right now we're enjoying very much looking back at the Earth, and it's just a fantastic experience, and I just can't wait to get back and start telling people about it.
Simpson about June 10th with the fur brigade, consisting of a number of yacht boats, each manned by 10 voyageurs.
For us Inuit, it means that Inuit oral history is very strong.
And we flew low over every inch of the country that could be. We were hoping that he would fire at us.
I guess 160 dives or so. There are shrimp, fish swimming around outside. It's just fabulous here.
Well, I'm a first for Canada.